Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the discussion A Banquet of Consequences, why the world faces an unusually uncertain economic future. Our speaker on the subject is Satijit. I hope I got that right. Satijit. He has spoken to us before. He is a globally respected former banker and consultant with over 35 years experience in financial markets. He prophetically anticipated the global financial crisis as early as 2006. The subsequent sovereign debt problems, the unsustainable nature of China's economic success, and the ineffectiveness of policy actions being taken by authorities to restore growth. In 2014, Bloomberg nominated him as one of the 50 most influential financial thinkers in the world.
You've never had it so good. Those words were spoken by Harold Macmillan in 1957. Today, when that phrase is used, it's used in a pejorative way, to deride political promises. But at the time Harold Macmillan uttered those phrases, it was actually correct. Britain was doing extremely well. We will now look back at the times of the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and especially the 1980s and the 1990s as a time when we had it very, very good. Let me paint for you what your future is. If you're in full-time employment, the number of you in full-time employment will probably shrink to around 20 to 30% of the population. The other 70% will be mini entrepreneurs. What that actually means is you are a piece worker in the 19th century sense of the term. You will hire out your labor to people who can hire it at their discretion, on rates they determine, not subject to things like minimum wage or any sort of conditions. You will not have sick leave, you will have no long service leave, you will not have anything paid for your tools, you will have no training, and you will be played off against whosoever there is to compete. As Jay Gould, the famous speculator in the American Railways gold rush, once said, you can always count to hire one half of the population to kill the other half. If you want a house, think. For most people, housing will become not a basic right of shelter, it will become a luxury. Today in Australia we enjoy a massive rise in house prices. The strange thing is, it actually doesn't benefit anybody. The first thing is, let's look at the composition of the housing market in Australia. 1/3 of people own their houses outright, 1/3 of people have borrowed to buy their houses, and 1/3 of people rent. So let's look at the fate of each of them. If you rent, you're at the mercy of uncertain tenancy arrangements, and those rents can go up and down at will. If you basically borrowed to buy your house, the high prices don't help. In fact, we have the world's largest level of household debt, mainly related to mortgages. And every time interest rates go down, basically the house prices go up, so you end up basically borrowing more, so you're still paying the same amount that you would have. So there's no actual benefit from lower interest rates. Most of you will have noticed the interesting reaction yesterday to the rise in interest rates announced by one of the Australian banks. My only reaction to that was, it was only 0.2%. What happens if interest rates get back to anywhere near normal levels? And you would have read why the bank in question increased interest rates. Because to provide greater reserves, for the loans that they've made, which will never ever be repaid. And the 1/3 who are sitting back saying, well, I don't owe anything on the house and I'm now rich. Perhaps we should look a little bit more deeper into their world. Their assumption is that they basically have this great asset. The problem with this whole fallacy, which Australians drink with mother's milk, is that a house you own is not actually an investment. It is what in economics is referred to as a consumption good. It is shelter. So you're assuming you'll be able to sell the house and somehow realize the money, but you've still got to find a place to live. And if prices of houses are high, the price you pay will also translate into a higher price for what you got. Then you say, well, no, what I'm going to do is downsize. I have never ever seen anybody who's downsized in Australia go to a smaller house. Downsizing is kind of a reverse process in Australia. You downsize to a bigger house, so it's kind of an oxymoron. When you do that, the problem is there's a whole cohort of people in Australia who have all followed this innate same strategy, who will all get to retirement age at or about the same time, and who will all basically be trying to do exactly what you are doing at precisely the same time. And you're also relying on an innate assumption that there will be somebody in this endless Ponzi game of housing to buy the house from you at a higher price, which means essentially they will be able to keep borrowing higher and higher amounts to do so. Thinking of retirement? Retirement until the 1930s and 1940s was a luxury. People didn't retire, they died. Now the question is, we've been sold this wonderful, wonderful idea that if we set aside 12% or whatever the percentage of our income is, it will miraculously grow to a large sum of money, which you will be able to live the life of Riley in your golden years. There's only one problem with that. Given what interest rates now are and returns are, the chance of most people being able to actually have sufficient to retire is nonsensical. To retire on what the government says for a couple, which is $50,000, for people who have their own abode, would require you, if you're retired today, to have $750,000. To do that, you would have had to save for roughly about 40 years at 15%, assuming that you and your partner earn roughly $80,000, which is not an unreasonable assumption in the greater scheme of things. But that assumes you're going to be getting something like 7 to 8% in returns consistently over 40 years. Now, some of you will have got that because you lived in the heyday of financial market excesses which provided those returns. But those days are now past. Today, the average Australian male retires on about $200,000. The average Australian woman retires on about $110,000. And if you've retired and you're looking for income from the government, think again. Pensions are not going to go up, they're probably going to be static. There's going to be probably no reduction, but they will not keep up with the rate of inflation. If you haven't quite got to retirement age, the retirement age will forever be like the horizon, just getting further and further into the distance. The fact of the matter is, those three pillars of Australian life, a job, a house, and retirement, have all gone. So the question is, how did we get here? The answer lies in a very, very simple process. All of that relies on economic activity and economic growth. Now, trees do not grow to the sky, but economic growth apparently is something like a perpetual motion machine which can keep going forever. And what is more interesting, it can keep going forever at an ever faster rate. Now let's look at what economic growth is and why we are at the end of economic growth. The first thing is to understand economic growth, say pre-1980 and post-1980. Post-1980, economic growth was never really economic growth. It was manufactured growth. It was growth on steroids. Because the warning signs were in the 1970s, when after the two oil shocks, growth slowed down, there was very high inflation. We lived in a period called stagnation or stagflation. So everywhere around the world, our political leaders were trying to find a way to start the engines, to fire the animal spirits. And the process they used was that great aphrodisiac of economics, debt. So we use debt to drive the economy. Now, there's no magic about debt. There's nothing wrong with debt, provided you use it for the right purposes and in the right amounts. But what they did was start to use debt in a very curious way, which is the whole point of using debt was to accelerate consumption. So instead of actually saving up to buy something, what we actually did was we started to spend the money today, promising that we would pay. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that assumes that money that you got and you've used essentially has some characteristics. That you use the money for whatever purpose, and that provides enough income to pay back that debt. And there are three terms in finance created by Hyman Minsky. And the first one he called hedge financing. That's when you borrow money, and basically the amount of income you have covers both the interest on the debt and the repayment of the debt. The second one was called speculative finance. And speculative finance is when you borrow the money, your resources, your income can pay the interest, but not the principal. So you're reliant on being able to keep re-borrowing forever. The modern version of that is known as the interest-only mortgage. And the final one, which is known as Ponzi finance, is when you borrow money, but the amount of money you borrow cannot be paid, even in interest or in principal terms, from what you're making. So you're entirely dependent on the price of whatever you bought with it going up over time. By about the middle 1990s, the early 2000s, we had moved through each of those phases and we were in Ponzi finance. To give you a perspective on that, there are two statistics which are interesting. In the period from 1980 to 2007-2008, the growth in debt every year globally was almost double the growth in economic activity. In other words, we needed to borrow more and more money to drive this economy. The second statistic, which is interesting, is in the 1950s you needed $1 of debt, maybe maximum $2 of debt, to create $1 of economic activity. In the United States, by the time we get to 2007-2008, you need $4 to $5 to create $1 of economic activity. Today in China, on whom the Australian economy is gravely dependent, you need $6 to $8 of debt to create $1 of economic activity. And the money we got, we used injudiciously. Only 15% of the money that was borrowed during this period, this great boom, was used to build businesses, to build plant, to build equipment which produces revenue from selling goods and services. The other 85% was spent on consumption. Governments borrowed to give handouts to buy elections. Third, it was basically to find consumption to just fund lifestyle choices. And finally, most of the money actually was used for a rather surreal purpose, which was we kept buying and selling the same asset for higher and higher prices among each other, pretending that these things were going up. 2007-2008 was the sign that this game had come to an end. But we, of course, being human beings, ignored it and carried on much as before. The other part of growth was driven by entitlements. And we've talked about some of these. We promised ourselves things which could never be paid for. We promised ourselves pensions, we promised ourselves aged care, we promised ourselves health care. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, provided everybody pays the taxes or it's funded in some sort of logical way. We just forgot the second part of the equation. We actually agreed to the first part of the equation, which was logical because essentially businesses said to their employees, we can't afford to pay you more in the way of wages, but hang on, we'll give you all these promises in the future because they won't affect our performance today. Government said that to buy elections for the simple reason they didn't have to account for these until they came due. And everybody assumed that day would never ever come. And if you actually look at that, it's interesting. Some of you will know this. In 1889, when Bismarck introduced pensions in Germany, in the first modern pension scheme, you got the pension when you got to 70. The average life expectancy was 45. When Lloyd George did similarly in England, the retirement age was 70, life expectancy was 50. When General Motors gave very generous benefits to their employees, General Motors had 405,000 workers. They were supporting only 31,000 retirees. So for every retiree, you had 13 workers. By the early 2000s, their workforce had shrunk by 2/3, so they only had about 140,000 workers. They were paying benefits to 453,000 retirees. So there was now one worker for every 3 retirees. So the joke went that by the end of the 20th century, General Motors was being run to actually meet its pension and healthcare obligations, and by the way, it had actually a sideline in making cars as well. But we all acquiesced to this. We thought it was great. We never asked how this was all going to be paid for. Now, we can't do those things again. But there's some other problems which are worth talking about. People have this great misunderstanding of what growth is. If you look at history, till you get to about 1820, there is no growth. McNeill and Robert Gordon of Northwestern University has looked at long time series going back to Babylon. How they got the statistics from Babylon remains as much a mystery to me as I'm sure it does to you, but they assure me that they are reputable statistics. But the only growth you get is infinitesimal, and it's all got to do with population increase. But somehow, round about 1820, economic growth as a concept starts off. If you go back in business literature, in literature generally, before about the 19th century, the term economic growth does not occur. It's just not there. Okay. Very fortunately, at that point, the science of economics, the so-called science of economics, also didn't exist, which perhaps meant that they were better off than we are in at least one respect. If you actually look at what was going on after 1820, it's very important to look at that. The first thing is the population of the world exploded. Because sanitary conditions improved, medical care improved, population went up. And essentially, that was one of the big drivers of growth. Now, looking at the 21st century, people miss an essential fact. In the 20th century, the population of the world doubled twice. And I repeat that. The population of the planet Earth doubled twice. In the 21st century, it will not even double once. In fact, all the UN projections for population have brought that number down. It was supposed to be 11 billion, then it was supposed to be 10 billion. Now they're projecting 9. And the reason for that is declining fertility rates. And the fundamental thing is, if you're looking for population growth, and don't forget population growth, people getting jobs, people working, people spending money, people getting married, people buying houses, is actually one of the fundamental essentials which drives economic activity. That's not going to be there. And the second element of population is demographics. If the population isn't growing, an insidious thing cuts in, which some of us are familiar with. It's called aging. When you age, the entire dynamics of how you exist, what you spend, changes dramatically. And at a certain point, all of us are unable to work, so we need to actually rely on certain things to keep us going. And that becomes a net drain on our society. People look to Japan now, and it's very important to look at Japan because Japan provides a very, very good window into what the world will look like. And the head of the Japanese central bank once came out and said very, very clearly that Japan had two problems. One was a stock market and an asset price bubble in 1989 which burst. And the second was their demographics, which their population is shrinking. The popular joke goes in Japan that if you extrapolate the rate the population is shrinking, by the year about 2600, I think it is, there'll be about 600 Japanese left. So we can't look at population and demographics to drive growth. So what else do we have? We have productivity and we have innovation. One of the big things that has driven growth historically is productivity and innovation. So let's dig into those a little bit. The first thing about productivity is everywhere around the world we've observed that productivity rates have actually started to slow down, improvements have slowed down. And economists have spent a lot of time scratching their heads going, how could this be? It's blindingly obvious. It's blindingly obvious because where you get productivity improvements is in industrial processes. Because you can apply capital, you can apply technology, you can make widgets quicker. You can make more widgets. The economies around the world, particularly in developed countries, have changed. We don't make anything. In fact, in Australia, we barely make water. The crucial thing about that, effectively, is that it's a service-based economy. Okay? If you look at a service-based economy, it uses a lot of human input. And there's in economics what we call the Berbil Effect, which is if any process involves a lot of human input, improvements in productivity are very slow and very difficult to achieve. The classic example of that is probably somebody learning to play Beethoven's 31st or 32nd is a bit of a sonata. So the 32nd piano sonata today probably needs about the same amount of time that he needed when Beethoven wrote the original piece. And most of our growth industries, which is things like healthcare, aged care, are not industries in which you can get massive improvements in productivity. You can get some, there's no doubt about that, you can do things better. And people are looking at things like robotics and so forth. The robots around the world effectively are very good at certain things, but to this day, they still haven't quite mastered the art of folding the washing. What about innovation? We have a Prime Minister who at every opportunity uses innovation as a noun, verb, adjective, adverb. The question is, what does he mean? Well, let's look at innovation. If you look at innovation, you can split it into three basic revolutions. The first revolution was steam engines and railways, James Watt, pretty much. The second one was the most important one, the second one, which was basically electricity. It was the internal combustion engine. It was petroleum and rearranging hydrocarbons. It was sanitation. Running water, sewerage, and all of those wonderful things are far, far more interesting than people actually acknowledge. And the last one was communications and entertainment in the form of telephones, telegraphs, and all the paraphernalia we now take for granted. And the last one is the computing, which is from probably the 1960s. Robert Gordon in his work at Northwestern found that it was the second one, which is by far the most important. And the best way to understand that is to look at the fact that it had a long tail. So all those things that were invented, you could spin out into new things and new things and new things, until basically it became a complete ecosystem which drove economic activity and improved living standards. And the way to think about this is if you take somebody from today and plonk them into the 1960s or the 1950s, the world they encounter will not look fundamentally different to the world that they have today. I mean, the equipment's slightly different, but basically all the essential elements are not different. But take the same person back to the middle of the 19th century. They would not even recognize the world they've landed in. It would be as alien as the surface of Mars, with or without water. Now the interesting thing is, let's talk about the great thing that everybody talks about, which is the computing revolution. Robert Solow, the economist, once said that you can see productivity improvements as a result of computing everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And he was actually correct. And this has puzzled people for a long period of time. I don't think he's being quite fair, because there were massive improvements from the 1960s to the 1990s, and that involved automating processes and ultimately linking up computing and network effects like the internet, which are very, very powerful. But the crucial thing is, since that time, that revolution has stagnated. And let me illustrate that with a few examples. Everybody gets very excited about smartphones, okay? And I'm led to believe that essentially Stephen Jobs, the late Stephen Jobs, is actually not God. God called him God. The reality is, what Apple is important to understand if you're going to understand innovation. Apple was not an innovation. Stephen Jobs was a genius at taking other things and combining them. So smartphones actually have destroyed mobile phones, personal digital assistants. Remember the Palm Pilots and all sorts of things you had. Walkmans and all those MP3 players you used to carry around for music. It's destroyed the camera industry because it's a very powerful camera. It's destroyed watches because it comes with a watch. So if you actually look at the revenue smartphones generate, the way to correctly estimate its innovative potential is to deduct all those industries that it's actually cannibalized. And if you do that, it actually is not that powerful. The second thing about this whole area of innovation is, if you actually look at, since the 1990s, what have we done? Basically, there are two crucial elements to most innovations. One is this strange phenomena called social media, which I refer to rather tartly as basically cheap narcissism. And the other one, which actually accompanies this, is basically consumer marketing. It's become a way to sell. And in a society which is consumption driven, and I would argue most of it's mindless consumerism, it's basically become synonymous with innovation. The most interesting example was Amazon's phone, which had basically a point and shop feature. So basically there was like 50 million items that you could point to on their catalog and almost instantaneously buy it via their phone. I called it point and shoot yourself in the foot. So basically these are really not innovations in the sense that the internal combustion engine or aeroplanes or jet engines ever were. And the other thing which is really destructive about this is how this industry now works. And there's a phrase which everybody throws around, including our Prime Minister, called disruptive innovation. Now, disruptive innovation actually has a meaning. It was the work of Professor Christensen at Harvard University, who actually, interestingly enough, as an aside, tried to put this into practice by getting some money from some people to invest. The fund went bankrupt within about a year. So perhaps he should write the theory, not the practice in this sort of sense. But Christensen's theory was pretty straightforward. If you read his work, it's actually very insightful. He said, essentially, a lot of these innovations are disruptive in the sense, what you're doing is you find an incumbent, an established player in a particular industry. And then what you do is you create something which balkanizes some of his business. And the way you do it is by making it cheaper, and you lose money. You allow other people who can't afford the other product to come in. The whole aim is not to create an industry in the same sense as Edison would have wanted to create something and create an industry. You've got only one objective, which is basically make it so annoying for the incumbent that they write you a very large check for you to go away. And this is funded by venture capitalists around the world. In fact, if you look at innovation today, it is not about technology, it is about the financing of these investments. The key players in this game are the venture capitalists, and the venture capitalists have basically the attention span of a gnat. So essentially what they're doing is they're putting money out, and they'll put money out for 10 similar ventures, knowing that not all of them are going to work, but one might work, and then being able to sell it very quickly, either to a disingenuous public who are looking for the next Google, or alternatively, to sell it to an incumbent in a trade center. So all our technological innovation has been trapped in this vicious cycle, which actually doesn't create very much at all. Instagram is not the internal combustion engine. Facebook is not nuclear fission. And Google isn't a patch, no matter what you think about it, to the Gutenberg press. And it will not be as revolutionary as people think. But then let's talk about other things why the world's not going to grow, which is things that people don't talk about, which is the constraints of the planet. We live in a closed system, pretty much closed. The only element that's open is we rely on solar energy and the Earth will die, but because the sun will die, but don't panic, it's got 4.6 billion years to go, so it won't affect you and me in a material sense. But the crucial thing here is to look at 3 or 4 constraints. The first is water, which we don't talk about very much. 2.5% of the water on the planet is what we live on as a species. Because the rest is locked up in ice caps or salt water, which needs an incredible amount of energy to liberate into drinkable water. Water provides 70% of what you eat. One way to think about it is a single espresso, if you're going to drink one, is 140 litres of water. A single slice of toast is 40 litres. A serving of bacon requires 480 litres of water. Each day, every single person, depending on where you live and your lifestyle, needs between 2,000 and 5,000 litres of water. The crucial thing is, 40% of the world already suffers from water scarcity. And if you look at the UN figures, by the middle of this century, that number will be much, much higher. And water is entirely a closed system. The evaporation and liquefaction, it's a completely closed system. Yet we don't respect water. We use it for some truly absurd purposes. To give you an idea of what population and resources and the equation is, if population of the world goes up at the rate it's going up, we need to find 1 new Rhine river every year from now on. Food? Well, the first thing about food is the amount of arable land, which is about 3.4 billion acres, hasn't changed in 40 years. In fact, it's shrunk because of degradation of soil, arid zones increasing. And we need to increase food production by 60 to 100% by 2050 to feed the population of the world. And the most interesting thing is we've been able to keep up with demand, and there's 2 demands. One is population going up, the other is as people move up the economic scale, their food habits change. They're not satisfied with lentils, they want bacon. And if you actually look at that food, it's now completely dependent on 2 factors which are both now problematic. The first is improving the yield of crops. And we're now in a decaying S-curve, which means gradually it's gone up very quickly, now it's decaying and it's starting to fall. The other thing we've done, which is remarkable, to create these super productive grains and crops, what we've done is narrowed down. If you go back to probably the year 1500, the Earth had roughly around 3,000 different types of grains that you were growing. Today, the major part of your food crop is less than 30 types of grain. You use 300, but 30 contribute most of what you eat. And most of them are corn derivatives, if you actually look at them objectively. Which means you're extremely vulnerable to a parasite or something which spreads very quickly, and you have the equivalent of what became the Irish potato famine. The Earth is powered by roughly 80 to 90% by 3 things: coal, oil and gas. Now, this may actually interest you. The gallon of petrol, or the 4.5 litres of petrol that you consume when you drive your car from, say, here to somewhere, required 10 tons of organic matter buried under immense pressure and heat for roughly around 500 million years to be created. It's liquid sunlight. And it's not being made anymore. Yet we, in a couple of hundred years, will have ended up consuming roughly around 2 to 3 billion years of creation of those materials. And people say, oh, don't worry about it. We can have renewables like solar. Don't worry about it. We can grow sugarcane and make ethanol. Let me just debunk those arguments for a second. Firstly, let's take ethanol. To fill one tank for an SUV would require the amount of corn sufficient to feed one person for an entire year. So you have a choice. You have a car or you live. Let's now look at renewables, which excites people quite a bit. The first thing about renewables is renewables can never ever perform the function of fossil fuel. The reason is simple. Fossil fuels are the work of genius because they're tiny and release more energy than anything equivalent. And they have 3 or 4 characteristics which are extremely important. The first is what we call continuous power, or the problem of intermittency. If you have solar, if there's no basic sunlight, or the wind isn't blowing and you're dependent on wind, you're not going to get power. So you shut down everything for a while until you get power. Fossil fuels aren't like that, because as long as you have the fuel and you can feed the fuel into the generators, you can get power on tap. It has the highest energy density in terms of, if you look at the weight and the release of energy, there is nothing like that. And the greatest one of that is gasoline. It's one of the most remarkable compounds that you can have. Hydrocarbons are one of nature's great strokes of genius, if you look at it. The other thing about solar and things like that is they're all in the wrong place. If you look at the United States, all the solar you can generate is in the southwest part of the country, except all the industry and the population are in the wrong parts of the country. So you have to rejig the grid, and power doesn't travel well. And the other thing is you need large land masses to create the same amount of solar energy that you need from a power station. You need an area which is thousands of times bigger, which means you start to get into land use issues in terms of, are you going to grow food or are you going to make power? But look, I'm probably boring you. These are not things you want to hear. And then there's, of course, climate change. Whether or not you believe there's climate change, one thing is absolutely palpable. Go and look at your insurance premiums. That's because extreme weather events are getting much, much more regular. And to give you an idea of what that means, is we're now concerned about a few million people sadly displaced in the Middle East, seeking asylum in Europe. 600 million people on the planet Earth live in areas which, if the water level changes by 5 to 6 meters, would have to move. How, I ask, will the world cope with it? India has a solution. Bangladesh is one of the lowest lying countries in the world. The Indians have built a wall around Bangladesh. So basically what they're going to do is watch the 220 million people or a part thereof drown. So what are we going to do about all this? I'll tell you what our lords and masters are going to do about it. Nothing. The reason is, the only way you change anything is to change a fundamental compact between the population and the political system, which is the political system promises you endless improvement in living standards, endless growth, something for nothing. And they would have to basically turn around and make a Churchillian speech, promising you nothing more than sweat, tears, lower living standards, and massive sacrifices. And I doubt with that even the best spin doctors in the world could make into a palatable message for today's public. So we were going to not even attempt the real solutions. What we're going to attempt is the faux solutions. So we're going to concentrate on doing the wrong things better rather than doing the right things wrong. So this is what they're going to do. The first thing they're going to do is practice something called financial repression. They've got to reduce the debt. So how are they going to do it? Well, they're going to do it using financial repression in the following ways. Your taxes will go up. Your headline taxes may not go up, but all sorts of strange things will happen. There will be surcharges. There will be additional levies. There will be co-payments. There will be means testing. The Australian government's actually worked out a very good way of lowering their actual expenditures on many things. If you've ever run Centrelink, Medicare or anything, the phone system is miraculous as a cost-saving device because they put you on hold endlessly and then the phone line just drops out. So basically the idea is to make it impossible for you to get your entitlements. And if you look at their website, it doesn't help. If you go to their offices, there's nobody there. It's just a marvelous piece of technology to prevent anything actually happening. Some of you, I think, are smiling. Perhaps you've experienced the joys of this method of doing it. The dishonesty of it is what sticks in my gut. Then you're going to get some very subtle measures. In Europe, we now have negative interest rates. For those of you not familiar with negative interest rates, let me explain what happens. You put your money into your bank and they give you back less. If you didn't hear me correctly, I will repeat it. You put $100 into the bank, and when you go to get it out, they give you 98, and saying, you should be grateful. You don't believe me. Most of Europe now has negative interest rates. And those rates are going to get negative. Janet Yellen, the head of the US Federal Reserve, was asked, was negative interest rates a possibility? She said, you can never rule that out. But why is this whole game how is this game being played? You will in the next 5 years see a move to prevent you from using cash. And it's being dressed up in all sorts of ways. The best way it's being dressed up is apparently it's a hygienic measure to actually prevent transmission of diseases. Andrew Haldane is the chief economist of the Bank of England. I don't think discretion is his better attribute, because he gave a speech in London saying why cash should be banned, and he was quite open about it. He said, when the next crisis comes, and it will come very, very soon, central banks around the world and governments have no tools left, because interest rates are at zero, the balance sheets of governments won't allow them to spend money. So we need to have a mechanism. So we have to ban cash, because we will post massive negative interest rates like 5 or 10%, which by the way means 5 to 10% of your savings will be confiscated each year. But if people are allowed cash, they will all take their money out of the bank, and this won't work. So we have to prevent them taking the money out. This was from the chief economist of the Bank of England in a public speech announcing the underlying strategy. I don't think the Chancellor of the Exchequer was actually handing out thank you notes for this particular speech. But you don't believe me. What other things will happen? Money will be confiscated. You put your money in a bank today. The bank regulations have changed. These are known as the bail-in rules. What that actually means is over any amount which is protected by insurance arrangements or guarantees. The government, through its regulator, has the right to write down that debt if the bank is in any way loss-making or insolvent. This has already happened in Cyprus. This is about to happen in Greece. Remember, I said I would mention Greece. And it will happen in other countries. In Spain, the state pension fund has only now one asset that it's invested its money in: Spanish government bonds. The government has forced them to buy basically government bonds. The Argentines are cleverer than that. They just confiscated the money out of the state pension funds, basically, and they just took it. There's no point pretending we're not going to take it, so let's just basically take it. At least there is some admirable honesty in that. And this will be actually accompanied by political repression. Yes. Sorry? I've got another 5 hours. That should be fine. That should be absolutely fine. That should be absolutely fine. Juvenal, the great Roman satirist, once said, "How you rule countries with bread and circuses. They will give you enough bread to stave off revolution. And the circuses, well, leadership challenges once or twice a year, you know, a few smartphones and a few devices, the Kardashians, a bit of reality television, should keep the system going for a bit longer, shouldn't it?" Both sides of the political spectrum, in terms of their honesty in dealing with that, is suspect. Why do I say that? Keynes, writing in the 1930s, said that in Britain in the 1930s, you faced the choice between two parties. The first party was the stupid party. He meant the Conservatives. They were bigoted, inbred, basically deeply elitist. And they were so stupid that they didn't understand that the system required them to make small accommodations because they were terrified of this thing called the Bolshevism. On the other side was what he called the silly party, which was the left of centre Labour Party in England, which basically mistrusted anything to do with business, anything which made money, anything which created wealth, didn't understand anything about the economy, and basically promised a massive utopian future that they couldn't even describe, far less actually trace the way there. The interesting thing is, if I look around politics today, the only observation that I have, how little has changed since Keynes made that statement. Ultimately, the world has postponed indefinitely dealing with any of its challenges. So what we've done is risk stagnation or collapse. I'll give you the odds. I think there's probably a 1 to 2% chance that these policies of printing money, doing all these fantastic pieces of financial engineering, might create a sustainable recovery. Somebody asked me the other day why I gave it 1 to 2%. I said, hey, look, there might be life on Mars, we can introduce them into our trading system, or somebody might be able to basically discover extraterrestrial intelligence, because I've never found it on Earth, so that might help solve our problems. And then on the other side, you know, you might actually have somebody very bright who solves a problem like cold fusion or something, which gives us a new source of energy. You never know, it might happen. 70% chance of stagnation, which is you will see your living standards slowly eroded. By the way, that's the best outcome. The other 28 or 29% is we don't make the decisions, something goes wrong, and the biggest chance is actually an error by policymakers, people like central banks, error by governments, or alternatively, simply the system loses that wonderful thing which holds it together, which is a system of belief. That everybody looks at each other and says, this isn't going to work. And that may be economic, that may be political, that can be social. Remember, in the 1930s, not dissimilar conditions existed. And we can see in the politics of, I suppose, populism that we're starting to see in different countries, a similar trend of people from the right and left extremes arise. But look, not only am I boring you, you don't believe me. Because anyone who questions anything today is held up to ridicule because they're apparently professional, permanent pessimists. If you say anything about any of the things that we've spoken about tonight, you're a member of a reality-based community. I actually looked up what Karl Rove meant when he was talking about reality-based communities. These are people who apparently believe that solutions must be based on facts rather than wishful thinking. John Keenan was probably the most acute observer of the Cold War. And he once wrote, "The truth is sometimes a poor competitor in the marketplace of ideas. Complicated, unsatisfying, full of dilemmas, always vulnerable to misinterpretation and abuse." But if you seek truth, you may find comfort. If you seek comfort, you will find neither truth nor comfort. And in the end, despair. Chesterton. Sooner or later, we all have to sit down to a banquet of consequences.
Well done.